Welcome to Signs. Each week a guest brings one sign of their choice, whether an icon, symbol, an index, a gesture, inscription or object, and we have a conversation to uncover its meanings, its histories, the social roles it plays, and how it succeeds in doing so. Episodes are either in English or in French, and translated versions are available on the Signs website and YouTube channel. This week on Signs, I'm delighted to receive Brendan Graham Dempsey. Brendan is Director of Research at the Institute of Applied Meta Theory, where he studies the evolution and development of worldviews and human meaning-making systems. He holds an advanced degree from Yale University, where he studied religion and culture. His primary interests include theorizing developments in culture after postmodernism, productively bridging the divide between science and spirituality, and developing sustainable systems for life to flourish. His books include Metamodernism, or The Cultural Logic of Cultural Logics, and the multi-volume Evolution of Meaning series. You can find all of Brendan's information, links to his sites, articles, and books on sciencepodcast.com. So welcome, Brendan, to Signs. I'm so excited that you accepted this invitation.
I'm very excited to talk to you and go through this material. This is really exciting, a little bit different from the sort of things I usually get to talk about. So I'm taking this as a fun opportunity to go in directions I don't often get to explore with people. So thank you very much for the invitation.
You're welcome. That sounds wonderful. Also, I know that the sign that you chose for this week's episode is very interesting, and we'll get straight into that, if you please. If you could tell us what it is. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll have a better idea of what's going on. So I strongly advise it. What it is and, what it means perhaps to you in the first instance.
Yeah, great. So maybe I'll do a little description, and then I've got a couple of slides here I can show your audience. And yeah, optimal is a visual experience, but hopefully it also will come through in an auditory format. So the sign I'll be talking about, I refer to as the kaleidoscopic eye. And in terms of its basic structure, it is a kind of mandala composed of eyes, with an eye at the center. That, I think, is basically the major kind of architecture that I'm working with. But there's a lot of different permutations to this, and there's a lot of conceptual overlay and symbolic sort of depths to this. But in terms of the kaleidoscopic eye, that's essentially it. There's a kind of radial kaleidoscope, usually of a spiraling fractal nature, but with an eye radiating from the center, and specifically kind of in its fullest form, radiating a spiraling fractal kaleidoscope of eyes. So that's the description, and then I've got some examples that I can share. If let me see, I'll share my screen, and then let me know.
Wow, that's very blue.
Yeah, let me find the full version of this. Here we go. Great. So are you saying the full screen there?
Wonderful. Yes. Thank you.
All right, so this is a very rough rendition of this. This actually comes from a book that I did a couple years ago called Emergentism, in which I was exploring a new symbolic architecture for a kind of complexification worldview. And I introduced this symbol in that book. And for the purposes of that, I tried to just make something that would work as a visual component. This was actually before generative AI. Now this would be very different. At the time, I was kind of just working with some various available graphics I could find online and using my rather limited visual editing skills. So this is just a very rough sketch of the idea, but I want to walk through a couple of permutations. One of the things I'm really interested about with this sign is the different places I see it. And I actually recently started a Facebook page just to keep track of some of these as I come across them online. But this is my sort of little template. And I want to go through a couple of different versions of this. first, I'll just kind of point out some of the historical, you could say, precedents or antecedents or other kind of archetypal representations of this. The mandala structure that's core to this whole sign is obviously ancient and ubiquitous, and you see it, cross-culturally, but there's a very rich mandala heritage, of course, from the from Eastern traditions. Of course, mandala means circle, and so, of course, in Tibetan Buddhism, various forms of Buddhism, there's mandala drawing and all of that. And I'll talk a little bit about some of that as it relates to some Jungian stuff in a minute. But a basic point is that the notion of the mandala structure is certainly a cross-cultural thing, which is a core element of this. This is an example with some eyes at the center and kind of radiating out. The other thing about the mandala more broadly is, again, it's sort of cross-cultural, and I think one of the most powerful versions of that you find in the Western tradition is the Empyrean, which is the representation of sort of the celestial hierarchies all encircling the center fire of God in heaven. Here's a medieval depiction of that, and again, a kind of classic mandala structure, converging towards the still center, and going through increasingly divine spheres of angels as they converge towards God at the ultimate center of everything. And here's a rendition of that by Dore. Oh, by the way, I'll note just this presentation slide deck I'm giving here. I regret to say I don't have attributions for any of these. So my apologies to everyone I'm going to be showing their work here, but didn't have time to kind of put that together. This one, though, is Dore, and it's his representation of the Empyrean, because Dante has this beautiful, sublime presentation of the Empyrean at the kind of climax of his Divine Comedy. And the final cantos of the Paradiso are a mystical move into the center of the mandala, of the divine mandala. You see this, of course, also in kind of broader Christian iconography, particularly in the High Middle Ages with the rose windows and the stained glass windows, that sort of thing, which was actually, do I want to go there? I'll just say briefly, this whole moment in Catholic history was actually really informed by the return of Pseudo-Dionysius into the kind of theological conversation. That's a long, convoluted story, but the light of these cathedrals was very theologically significant, and it was viewed through the lens of a particular mystical theology that was coming back into vogue through the return of the influence of Pseudo-Dionysius and his celestial hierarchy. Anyway, but that's all by way of comparison. Another kind of form of this where you get the eye specifically is sort of the all-seeing eye, which is, in a sense, the eye of God. It radiates out. It has the kind of circular mandala aspect, but it's kind of, this disembodied eye. And I'm going to talk in a minute about all of the significance of this. I'm just trying to get a lay of the land visually. But of course, this gets picked up by the Masons and others in terms of, the all-seeing eye. Of course, it's on the dollar bill now through that influence, but there's a long heritage here of engaging that archetype in that way. Here's a contemporary version that I found, and now we're getting into the contemporary stuff. So again, as I said, I've been really interested to find this all over. Of course, once you start looking for something, you keep finding it. So I'm aware of that. We can talk about the meta-modern things related to that if we want. But here was something that stumbled across my Facebook feed one day, and I thought, oh, there it is. That's the kaleidoscopic eye. You've got the eye at the center with the radiating spiral eyes all emanating out. Here is a very beautiful, refined depiction by the artist Alex Gray, a visionary artist, where, again, you've got this kind of mandala radiating from a center that's sort of engulfed in light, but the radiations out are these spirals and spirals of eyes. And in this case, you get the effect of actually, this piece is called Collective Vision, and you kind of get the sense of a shared collective sight, all being directed towards the center there. And I don't know if Gray had this in mind, but I mean, this is the idea behind the Empyrean in Dante, and in particular, the notion is that there's almost like this stadium seating, that everyone is engaged in the beatific vision of the divine, and they're all gazing towards the center, and that's kind of what the celestial hierarchy and the Empyrean are about. And I just find this a really interesting, kind of more contemporary or even new age depiction of basically the same idea. And of course, Alex Grey is very influenced by psychedelics and other kinds of psychonautic explorations in informing his art. Another work by him, I forget what this one's called. It's something like, I don't know, Holy Crystal or something. But again, multiplicity of eyes, radial, spiraling center, kind of a loose association there. And fractals, interesting thing as well. I could say more about the importance of the fractal dimension of this too. More contemporary depictions of some of this. I forget again the artist's name. I wonder if this is Diaz. I forget. But anyway, similar sort of things, hearkening back to a lot of the things I've already been describing. I think this might be by the same artist, but a very similar kind of depiction, eye and center radiating out. And then returning to sort of my depiction, one of the things I did in my book Emergentism was, I'll talk about this briefly at the end too before I close, but there's a sense in which the move towards the center is a kind of a progressive, developmental, increasingly sort of, growing in consciousness sort of move. And in my depiction there, which gets into some of my work around the developmental nature of consciousness over human history and the different epochs of ways of thinking about things, I came up with this version of it. I mean, there's already a sense of concentric circles overlaying the spiral, and there's a notion that you move into deeper levels of the circles as you move towards the eye. I'll mention the transcend and include aspect here that I was getting from the work of, say, Ken Wilber and the integral philosophy crowd. But this was just a depiction of this idea that I made. And I've also been really interested to see versions of this kind of architecture show up out there. So for example, again, this just kind of came across my feed the other, I don't know, a couple months ago. And it added an interesting new symbolic architectural layer to this. Of now you've got this sort of weaving, spiraling ascent towards this, kaleidoscopic eye. Here you've got the eye in the center of a rose, which I thought was also interesting because Dante calls the Empyrean the celestial rose in his work, and started to see this version crop up elsewhere. So here's kind of the Eye of Horus, which itself is also kind of an archetypal representation of this, but with this similar kind of winding, spirally trail. Also a pyramid here, and so you also then get eye above the pyramid, and then the all-seeing eye, and above the pyramid that the Masons were using. Just I kind of posting without remarks so far. Just like these are very interesting patterns. And again, we'll kind of unpack maybe what some of this means. But another version of this motif where you've got this winding spiral kind of helix moving towards the center of this radiating celestial sort of set of concentric circles. Clearly, we've got some kind of a macro scale and the micro scale kind of, the hermetic as above, so below thing going on, and some kind of, I don't know, a spiritual, something spiritual gathering down there. And then here's that one last version of these that I came across. Again, just in my Facebook feed, I don't even know what's going on here with this cat, but but you got this kind of weaving snake-like winding eye leading up to the kaleidoscopic eye. I don't know how else you'd really describe that. I don't know why it's a cat, but there's clearly a sense here of like, out of the body of the creature comes the spirit sort of thing. Anyway, we'll wrap this up. I've again just been really interested to see how these get how people kind of spontaneously produce this image. So here's just one that popped across my feed. Again, sort of eye, celestial. Yeah. Here's another a mandala, very specific mandala, radiating eyes out from the center. And one more here, someone doing something very similar and these are coming sort of from the visionary art community. And then of course with like generative AI recently, this has taken on some interesting new forms. So I've started following a couple AI, visual artists, and I keep seeing the same form show up, but now a bit more, I don't know, digitized in style. Last thing I'll say, and then conceptually, and then we'll get into other kind of, ideational elements of this archetype. It's been very influenced by integral theory, and part of the kind of the symbolism of integral theory is this set of concentric circles radiating out from the center. In that context, it's the Big Bang at the center, and there's a concentric transcendent include. But I've been very interested to sort of invert that to better reflect this kind of architecture. So instead of radiating out from the center, you'd actually start from the circumference and radiate in, and that becomes a map of increasingly nested spheres of complexity. And I've been interested to kind of weave these kind of big picture models into this sort of architecture. So that's basically it. And then that's my kind of simplistic version. So I'll stop sharing, and then I'll say a few things about the about some of the core ideas, and then I'd love to get your thoughts and have some discussion about this. But of course, one of the things about the mandala that Jung himself recognized was that you get the still point at the center is the unity that integrates all of the plurality in the circumference. So if you want to think about the infinity of the circle, which is what that is one kind of infinity. It's a kind of positive infinity, because it goes round, 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 and round, but also because a circle is a line curved in on itself. And so a line is infinite in extension, whereas a point, which is at the center of the circle, is also infinite, but in kind of a negative sense. It kind of, it's like a fraction of, or decimal 0.0000. You can always keep subdividing the point. So you got these two kinds of infinity that are in kind of direct structural relationship to each other. And actually, I think Pseudo-Dionysius himself gives some kind of, gloss about that, which I think is an interesting thing. So one of the conceptual ideas being, I think, included here in this whole architecture is very much this sense of moving from kind of plurality towards unity, which is a classic mandala conceptual idea. Now, then there's the I, and I want to emphasize that. Of course, the I, well, I say of course, whenever people talk about symbolism, it's always funny because they're like, I remember I was watching this thing, Joseph Campbell was like, the bear is the oldest of the gods. And I was like, wait, what? Like, and then, he would unpack that. But it's just funny how people hold court, like, and they just make these declarative statements, so of course the I is, okay, so I'm just going to do that because that's the register here that I want to work with. So the I think, is an archetype of consciousness, of awareness, right? Of seeing, vision logic, I guess you could say, in kind of the integral sense. The I think, is perennially a symbol of awareness in a way that I think is very powerful. And I think that that's a deep reason why this keeps showing up in this context. And so if we take the I to be symbolic of, or representative of consciousness, then this radiating sort of circling set of spirals, all moving, converging towards the center, seem, in my view of this symbol, to represent an evolution, or a progression of consciousness from earlier forms towards this kind of center. When I frame this in my emergentism book, there's an added layer here of the complexification, right? So starting from matter to life to mind to culture and so on and so forth, you get ultimately the center of the circle being basically the iconic representation of what Teilhard de Chardin would talk about as the omega point, right? So in that sense, the circumference is the alpha and the center is the omega. And of course, I think it was it Nicholas of Cusa who said something like, God is a circle whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere. The idea of God as circle, is an interesting thing here I want to emphasize too, in the context of Jung's recognition that God is the archetype of the self. And so when Jung started drawing all his mandalas, he found this to be incredibly therapeutic. And he concluded that basically the self archetype is a mandala. So this structure somehow represents the self, but it also simultaneously represents God. And of course, the insight there of the mystics that, those two are one, Atman is Brahman, that sort of thing, is very intriguing to me. But to see also in my context of complexification that the unity of the self with everything is this process underway, right? That you are, in Carl Sagan's words, we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. We are the universe waking up to itself. We are the universe, the cosmos gaining self-knowledge. So the self and God being one, through the process of the evolution of consciousness, as here seems to me to be represented by this, evolution or convergence of eyes towards the center. The aspect that Alex Gray brings to this with collective vision that you also see prefigured in the Empyrean is interesting, because there's also the notion that this is a collective phenomenon, that it is a through the seeing, through the mutual seeing, that is actually the substrate from which this all kind of emerges, as it were. And I find that very interesting as well. There's, I guess, a lot you could say about that, but I'll just mention it. We can come back to it. Maybe I'll pause there because I've already said a lot, but there's a lot more I could say, and maybe it'll surface a little bit when we have some conversation about this. But for me, I guess I'll just wrap up this little introduction here by just saying, very potent, rich symbol. Seeing it a lot, find that really interesting, has some spontaneity to it that people find it very organically. And so I think that there's something really intriguing about that. Of course, the history and the cross-cultural elements here are also intriguing, and the Jungian aspects of that. And the way, I think the last thing I'll say is, for me, what's powerful is seeing this through an evolutionary spirituality lens as somehow being a meaningful symbol for that kind of cosmology in a mythopoetic register. Okay, I'll stop and let's talk about all this.
Wonderful. Okay. There's so much to pick up on. I mean, as you were showing a couple of those examples, there was one in particular, it made me smile, like almost like a stadium with seating and, converging towards the central celestial point. And it just made me think that these mandala, especially the more graphic sort of interpretations of these, are kind of a Rorschach test as well, because like I kind of see a panopticon sometimes,
Thank you. This is actually, can I just speak to that real quick? I do want to mention this. And I should have included some pictures in this. This is a really interesting thing. So there's an inverted version of this. Basically, there's, you could say, the positive and the negative version. And the negative version shows up in a lot of different contexts that are basically everything I've been talking about, but in a negative way. So the panopticon's a great example, right? You've got the, you're always being watched. It's Big Brother, right? And all of that. But also think about, I mean, I mentioned the Masonic representation of this, but many people have seen sort of darker, more sinister elements to some of the ways these secret societies have thought about the all-seeing eye and a kind of new world order and all this stuff. So that's a version of I call this the Dark Empyrean. A really powerful version of this shows up actually in the film Everything Everywhere All at Once. So the everything bagel is a Dark Empyrean. It is a negative, inverted form of the Celestial Empyrean, but what is that? It's nihilism, right? So everything I'm talking about has an inverted dark form, which is no longer light and growing evolution of consciousness towards unity with divine. It's, the opposite negative version of that. So the panopticon is a good representation or form of that, I would say. But anyway, I cut you off. Keep going.
But another point was the Jungian therapeutics. If you come to any train station in France, you will find adult coloring books.
Right.
So that really, and they're all full of, they're just black and white printed mandalas, and you color them in. And that is very interesting when you talk about this possibility that there's some kind of syncretic evolution of this natural gesture to create these images that has been happening for millennia all over the world. These are always very enticing statements, aren't they?
No, they're great. Actually, you've reminded me of some. Well, I mean, again, like there's so much to say about a lot of this, but what would I say? The first thing is, so the Jungian element is really intriguing, and there's a lot that could be said about that. I'll pull up something in a second to maybe reshare another element of this, but right. So yeah, the coloring books are fascinating because just this sense that there's a popular interest very organically of just like, wow, this is calming and relaxing, sort of finding my still center, and the symmetry is also really important, right? I mean, there's something about like just that aesthetic joy of like it all is right, and so much about chaos versus order being found. and that really is also what an ego is like this formation of an ordered center out of, in the midst of all this kind of chaos. So that's an interesting thing. But of course, for Jung, he would sit and he would draw these out. So rather than even just having like them preformed and then you kind of, meditationally color them in, he would sort of like kind of feel into what was coming through and then have that be sort of a daily expression. For a while he was doing daily mandala drawing, right? And this is all directly related to this other element of Jung's work, I think, too, which is his active imagination and his red book work. And so the way that the symbol kind of wants to well up from you and find expression in an artistic register and a mythopoetic register seems to be this thing that the soul in the psychic sense, well, the psyche wants in a kind of therapeutic manifestation. So real quick, I also wanted to show, let's see, a version of these. Maybe I can. Yeah, why not? Let me share my screen again. So if you can see this, I started working on something a while ago called Omega, which was an epic poem that was sort of charting it was a journey of the universe in a Dantean sort of way, but in this case, it kind of tracks through the levels of cosmic complexification. And well, maybe I'll go back to the beginning here, because it opens up, that sitting down and sort of having, in this case, the what do you call them? The speaker of the poem has sort of ingested some entheogens after also reading a number of complexity theorists, mystics, and meta-modern works, and then has this kind of vision of a seraph that's going to lead them through the universe. And the seraph is named Dante. And I also have this sort of like textual commentary going on, but I won't get into that. Anyway, so that's the context of this. But then the person sees this mandala structure, right? And the Dante seraph emerges and is kind of communicating to them. But I just thought I'd give these versions as well, because this is a representation of the same kind of idea that I was exploring through my own kind of active imagination, mythopoetic stuff. So this is the multi-layered quadrants of the universe. In this case, it's presented in the kind of classic integral framing of moving out from the Big Bang, and then you kind of have space, and you have matter, and then you get to life, and then you get to mind, and then the multi-layered evolutionary levels of culture. But one last I'll just show you in this register, in this vein, is this one, which also, again, very steeped in kind of integral philosophy at the time I was doing this. So you have the kind of classic quadrants of individual, collective, interior, and exterior, but then the sort of radiation out. If I were to do this today, I would do it in the inverse, radiating in. But I just thought I'd add this into the mix because the mythopoetic version of this, I think, is a really important thing. And I think Jung is kind of obviously the classic sort of person about that. All right, I'll stop sharing there. So again, there's so much to be
wonderful. Said. Yeah, no, it's wonderful. And I was just thinking about, you were mentioning Campbell earlier on, and I think this spiral, the hero's journey, even he used it for these representations of process as well. But I'm intrigued about the spiraling in. So you're saying that you changed, that was a work you did previously a while back. So taking a more perhaps scientific analogy and going from the center to the exterior, or is that entropy, or?
I think it's different ways of representing the same thing, right? You can show something. If you think about complexification, you can think about it either as sort of, let's say you've got a center, and then you can add a layer, and then you can add a layer to that, add a layer to that. If you do it in that model, then you're having a concentric circle, set of circles emerging outward. And outward is the grow of complexity. And that's just as valid a representation as the inverse, which is, let's say you start with just a circle, and then you say, as a subset or subclass of that circle, there are, a holon within that. And then you'd say, okay, so if the largest one is just matter, then, life is a subset of all matter, but it's a smaller subset. And then mind is a smaller subset of life, and culture is a smaller subset of mind, et cetera. So there you actually have complexity increasing by moving towards the center rather than moving out from the center. And I like that one more because it conforms more to the vision of the kaleidoscopic eye, which is that as you move towards the center, you're reaching kind of that, Teilhard de Chardin kind of, omega point of maximal complexity and maximal consciousness.
Yeah, with all the colors creating white, as the illustrators do that very nicely, don't they? Sort of that vanishing point, I suppose. But so there's quite a few ways of actually looking at the kaleidoscopic eye, because when we think of kaleidoscopes, there is this notion of concentric circles. But you mentioned Dante, and for me, there's two things going on in the examples you've given. There is a certain continuum in certain examples of that, but there are others that seem to be more static, with hierarchies of, I suppose, more from the medieval, inspired by more medieval.
No, I think that's a great point, though, which is that this is why I see this archetype expressed. I think the deeper structure is there, but you can do it either as radiating concentric circles, or you can do it as a spiral. The spiral is just radiating concentric circles, but with the added element of the continuity, right? So that each of those kind of leads to the next. I like the spirals more because that's how nature works. And so, yes, there are sort of quantum leaps and things like that, but on the whole, I think this process, whatever we're talking about, the process is a continuous spectrum of conscious evolution, I guess you could say, if you want to view the symbol through that lens. The other thing too, which I didn't get into, which I think a lot of people go through a spiral phase, which I did. And I remember talking to a friend of mine at Yale Divinity School, and I was talking to him about Fibonacci and stuff. He's like, "Oh man, I was drawing spirals back in the 90s." It was sort of like, yeah, we all know what that's about. And it can also become a little cliche, shall we say, when you see the whole kind of new age spiral thing. But that all being said, spirals are very powerful. And I read a whole book on the Fibonacci sequence, which actually only sounds significant because it's a mathematical book. It was by Mario Livio, I think. Highly recommend. And the Fibonacci sequence is so cool, like mathematically.
It's so cool.
It's amazing. It's like there's and then the different expressions of it, of like 1 plus the square root of 1 plus, like all these are recursive So anyway, all of that's really interesting. And of course, then there's the thing about people seeing this in nature, right? And I think a lot of that's overblown, but a lot of that's very real, And so the fact of these logarithmic spirals in particular as versions of a kind of natural sacred geometry, I'm interested in. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. You were going to say something.
Yeah, no. I'm just umming and ahhing and enjoying this far too much to be a podcast host. I was wondering about, because your background in theology, and I was wondering what the original mystical utility of the kaleidoscopic eye would have been. Was it a focusing kind of a tool, a cognitive artifact in order to find, but on because they weren't coloring in, I guess.
Yeah. Well, so they kind of were, right? In their scriptoria, right? They were doing the illumination. So they were kind of like big, mystical coloring books. But no, I think that's right. Yeah. I would say, and again, I think Pseudo-Dionysius talks about this. I don't know. He probably doesn't use the exact phrase like a tool for meditation or anything like that. But it is I think that you can read it very much as literally a centering device. It is what would you say? One, again, in the context of this being a cross-cultural phenomenon, particularly also in which Eastern mystical traditions were doing something very similar with Cassina discs, for example, and meditation objects that would sort of orient the focus. So that's an interesting parallel. But I do think that there's something there around like, one, that element of like you're bringing your focus into something. And so the very notion of the beatific vision is kind of really interesting in the context of attentional, sort of spiritual practices of sort of like meditation, contemplation. The differences between contemplation and meditation, like Western and Eastern, is an interesting thing to kind of compare also, and we could talk about that. But like to the degree that there's some kind of attentional focusing going on, this is certainly a part of that. I think another thing that it does, though, is it is a representation of a increase in kind of intensity, of spiritual intensity, right? So when you start out here and then you move to the, what is it? So in the celestial hierarchy, I think you start with the angels, and then there's like the archangels, and then there's then I forget the exact order, but each time you do this, as you read through the celestial hierarchy of Dionysius, you're like moving up a level. And there's something also very powerful about levels, both in kind of mystical spiritual traditions, but in other contexts as well. I mean, I got really interested in, as I've been mentioning, complexity theory and integral theory and these kinds of things, largely because of that appreciation for the notion that things aren't just flat, that there's actually like levels to things. And of course, in the ancient context, that was the great chain of being. Now, that's very problematic for all sorts of reasons. The metaphysics and the ontology aren't right. But if you reframe the great chain of being as a kind of a scale of complexity, that becomes a very compelling idea. And so that's why I found these ideas very interesting, as they blend, kind of ancient mystical insights about, moving up the levels with something that's been going on over cosmic evolution for 14 billion years. Very cool idea. And so, but more as a meditational tool, just to keep it at that level, when you're reading the celestial hierarchy, like each time, like you're like, oh man, I'm so excited for that next level, like you're like reading like, oh, this is so cool, and but then the next level, and there's this sense of progression, of development, of moving closer and closer. And those kinds of things are also reflected in architectural representations of sacred space, right? So like the cathedral itself is a stone version of this cosmos, right? And as you move through this the lich gate, and you go in, and then and then you ascend, and then all of this is like, it is meant to evoke viscerally and psychologically an intensity through a kind of embodied engagement. So I think as a tool to meditation, this accomplishes that. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, like, it's without a doubt that embodied engagement you're talking of that's also rendered accessible to non-literate communities, which is probably the majority of people visiting these temples and cathedrals, and
totally
being able to engage, at least have the impression that they have had an equal access to a higher divinity.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really interesting way of relating to divinity in a vertical way, I guess is kind of the thing there, right? That there's something of, there is kind of this classic, the sacred versus the mundane, and to come into contact with the sacred and the numinous is the other, the profound other in this sense, and that there's a difference there that's meaningful. And then you mark out that difference with taboo and other kinds of things to make it special, to make it its own thing. And then I guess if you put that in a series of gradations, rather than it being a binary sacred versus profane, there are gradations of the sacred. I would say in a kind of Neoplatonic sense, they grade into the profane. I like that view, so that actually, all is sort of being, that sort of, like that was the Platonic vision of sort of being radiates out. So even there is no evil per se. There's just an absence of good, that kind of thing. But anyway, so if everything's sort of this graded, leveled, ontology, then one, you have like this profound sense of a hierarchy of value, and then to relate to it in that way, I think is also just true of our experience. Like we grow and we learn and we develop, and there's something about the sense of the lifespan being a learning process and a growth trajectory, and the spiritual journey as being a pilgrimage with major milestones along the way. And so I think it rings very true to our experience, but it is interesting how it can manifest in all these different forms, right? In architecture, where people feel it, or in visual versions where they can just kind of get it. But then also in literary forms. I mean, Dante's entire Divine Comedy is this grand architecture of leveledness of being leading up to God, or Bonaventure in The Soul's Journey to God, similar kind of thing. So I think there's something very profound about that at many, many levels.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And on a personal evolution level as well, I think, a lot of people today are concerned about well-being and their inner selves and their outer selves and all their selves. And it's kind of reassuring to see that people have been engaging with these symbols for a very long time, and perhaps in a manner, repetition as a heuristic of self-analysis, looking at exactly the same mandala or exactly the same symbol, but absolutely not engaging with it in the same manner 5 years earlier or 10 years later, or in varying states of emotional well-being or distress, or so that the complexity there goes into the representation, but it also retreats into the person, I suppose.
Yeah. There's a lot there. I like the idea, of was it T.S. Eliot said that, oh gosh, what's that idea about, going and then coming back and finding yourself, but not as you were, or whatever, something like that. Yeah. The continual return to things, but you've changed. So it feels different. So that's an interesting thing of like returning or repeating with this same symbol, but having new things kind of come out from it. So there's a lot to that. I also think, there's a lot, there's a lot here, but there's an interesting thing where, grades, if you think about grades, and now we're getting more into just to the concepts of the sense of levels rather than but it does all, I think, this symbol, I think, is supposed to pack all this kind of into it in some meaningful way, or can be seen to do so. Grades, you're kind of like, oh, the ninth graders know things that I don't know because I'm in the seventh grade. Like, oh, wow, and there are these mysteries, right? And of course, all human traditions, institutions, not only have versions of hierarchy, but also, hierarchy in the etymological sense, right, of a holy order. Where there's a kind of, like you move up the level, and there's a sense of accomplishment and revelation. And, of course, you find that not just in terms of skill progression through like sacred martial arts for whatever, and different belts, or these Masonic, different degrees and that sort of thing. But in this kind of hierarchy sense, you've got the notion that reaching a new level is an insight into a new set of skills and understandings and attainments. And that's kind of your zone of proximal development, to use the, kind of developmental psychological term for it. But there's an interest there, and it seems manageable, right? It seems like you have an orientation and a goal. You're on a teleological arc somewhere. So maybe to kind of, I think, give that its sense of like importance, if you take that away. And I do think a lot of what the kind of story of disenchantment and modernization and secularization can be read as is sort of a loss of a lot of this psychic architecture, right? For good and for ill. But when you take it away and you're kind of living in a flat land and you lose your kind of sense of, orientation, you get disorientation and confusion and the loss of the cosmos, and so I think a lot of the alienation, confusion, meaning crisis stuff, relates to that. And at least as I was navigating my existential crisis and nihilism and stuff, and these kinds of things became very profound and interesting to me. And I don't think that that's a coincidence either. Again, even if it's, really just seen through a kind of Jungian psychoanalytical lens of just like, there's therapeutic work to be doing to make an ego work and hold it together. And there's interesting symbolic elements to that. All right, I'm rambling. I'm going on too much, but there's so much about all this.
No, it's really good. I don't know. In my notes were just, anyway, I was just unconsciously writing something down, and it was atheism suffers from pink elephant syndrome. Oh my gosh!
Say more.
No. I don't think I need to go there. I'm going to just edit that out. There's it's such it's a wonderful symbol. Thank you so much for bringing it, because some of my guests have been really cheeky, I have to say.
How cheeky?
They've been excellent guests, but they've brought various versions of their symbol, which are quite differing. Yes. So I'm very pleased that we spent so long on just one symbol. And of course, as you say, we could spend so much more. I would actually like to just do a very mild excursus, just so that you can tell the listeners a little bit about your work.
Sure.
Yeah, because it's really very interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
So kind of give a little overview of the stuff that I tend to get up to with my work is the idea there?
Yeah, with your institute. I don't know if you call it an institute, but...
Well, I technically have, there's a couple institutes I'm associated with now. I am at a place called Sky Meadow in Vermont. It is a retreat center that I run, but I also started Sky Meadow Institute, which is located here, which is dedicated to advancing and promoting systems-based thinking about the things that matter most, which is sort of like bringing a complexity lens to, matters of ultimate concern. And what that means is everything from applying, well, okay, I think understanding complexity and systems thinking is really important for kind of a lot of the stuff that I do. So that's a good, way into this stuff. So, if you want to think about a contrast between a kind of linear, singular variable mechanic Newtonian framework of way of seeing the world, right? The clockwork universe, everything's a machine. You can kind of take it apart and put it back together. That's one way of seeing reality, but there's a lot of problems with that. And the mechanistic, materialistic, reductionistic, deterministic framework is a problematic one. Now, fortunately, the last 50 years plus, there's really seen a flowering of a profoundly different paradigm. It emerges out of the profound advances of modern science, but into new territory that appreciates so much of the chaos, the complexity, the ecosystem dynamics. Now, I'm doing a poor job kind of trying to summarize systems thinking, but the basic idea is that it's not just a matter of breaking something down into its parts to understand how it works. That works for some things, but actually not most things. Rather, you often have to take the parts in the relational context of the whole to both understand the parts and the whole. And so that is a system then at that point. And if you aren't approaching something as a system and you're reducing it to its parts, you might actually be missing actually what this thing is. So when a lot of people try to do this with things, with systems, and then they look for the parts and they reduce them, they're actually they're missing the forest for the trees. So when you are open to the idea of systems, a lot of things then enter your ken that weren't there before. And it's taken humanity a long time to wrap its head around systems conceptually. I think intuitively we've understood them for a long time, but conceptually and mathematically and scientifically to really know what a system is and all that. These are very complex phenomena. I mean, that's why it's called complexity science. And what's interesting is that there are novel kinds of things that happen with complex phenomena that, that are different than just sort of mechanistic, simple things put together in parts, right? So the idea of emergent properties is really core to this, that parts in relationship creating a new level whole can create a sum greater than the sum of its parts. They can create a whole greater than the sum of its parts. And that whole has novel properties that aren't in the parts themselves. You need the parts to come together and interact in particular ways to produce the whole. And that is called emergence. And there are different kinds of emergence, there are different scales of emergence. A kind of classic example is a murmuration of starlings, right? They have a kind of form to them that seems to follow its own logic, but yet none of the individual starlings knows what that logic is or is thinking in those terms. But there's something that emerges out of all these parts operating together.
Yeah, I took that Santa Fe Institute course.
Oh, cool. Okay, yeah. So they're a good, they're great they're like the complexity mecca, I think, in many ways. So to bring this back to what I do, though, this is a whole new way of seeing reality. It's a new way of understanding the world. And then if you can bring that lens to the things that matter most, I think that's arguably what we need to do right now for many, many reasons. So we need to see more how systems operate and to not be reductively taking things apart. It's a more kind of holistic approach to things, but not in a wooey way. Though I'm into the wooey stuff too, I suppose, to some degree. But it's a way of appreciating phenomena that's historically also been disregarded by kind of classic mechanistic ways of seeing. And then you can actually see, wait a second, consciousness isn't just an epiphenomenon. And, actually, maybe this whole kind of conventional agricultural approach to what we eat is not the best way. So you get a systems view of life. So yeah, my institute is sort of about doing that kind of thing. And then I guess just real quick, I would say, and then I'm the director of research at the Institute of Applied Meta Theory, which has a similar kind of focus. But I don't know. That's a little glimpse into stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you. Yes, because I'm sure that after listening to this, lots of people are going to want to know where to find you. Anyway, all your information will be available on the Science Podcast website.
With one retraction, I want to make one retraction. I said I was sort of into the wooey stuff, and I kind of am, but I want to qualify that. I'm really interested, obviously, in the relationship of science and spirituality. But I'm also, I have a background being very skeptical and cynical. And so while I'm not a kind of classic cynic or nihilist anymore, I do want to have rigor when it comes to approaching spiritual topics. So there is a way, I think, that I'm very attracted to approach spiritual questions and mysticism and these ideas of like evolution of consciousness. But I really like them to be very scientifically rigorous. So I just wanted to throw that in there. I didn't want to totally throw in my hat with the woo, but at the same time, I've also just been going on for a long time about a kaleidoscopic eye. So people can take of that what they will.
No. That's very rigorous. Also, your necklace is very pretty, and I would say borderline woo.
Yes, that's true.
You know,
that is true. This was like $1. And it's funny though, because this is a great point. This is a great opportunity to talk about this. People will often ask me, "Oh, that's such a beautiful necklace. What does it mean?" And it actually doesn't really have a significance to me, and it's very sad. So then I started thinking about, well, gosh, if I'm going to be having a necklace and doing a lot of podcast things where people see my necklace, and I should probably have a symbolically rich symbol, and I haven't not yet made that leap. So ironically, despite my great interest in symbols and whatnot, this is conceptually meaningless to me. However, I did get
Oh,
this is a symbol.
A hieroglyph.
It is sort of. What this is also a representation, symbolic representation from the Emergentism book, where I consider this a representation of emergence. So this is meant to represent an eye in all the contexts that we've been talking about. And this line here,
Can I take a screenshot?
Yeah, I can also send like an actual depiction of this. But the point is, it's supposed to represent an eye emerging out of the water. So this is sort of like the baseline unconscious waters, that sort of Jungian thing and all that. And then you get the eye of consciousness emerging. That's a very beautiful symbolic summation, I think, of the cosmic evolutionary story as consciousness has emerged from unconsciousness. And so that's my symbol for that. So this is more meaningful to me. And it's also here on my little mug that
wonderful.
My wife made for me. Yeah. So anyway, but this is garbage.
Okay. I love the idea that you could retroactively sort of imbue it with some kind of
Yes, and I've thought of doing that. You mean this? I've thought about
saying,
you
could have a ritual.
Oh, yeah.
You could create a ritual and give it some kind of...
At the next Metamodern Spirituality Lab, I'll do a ritual that will imbue this with some meaning, and it will represent, therefore, the emergence of meaning from meaninglessness. How does that sound? So that's what, next time someone asks me about this, I'll talk about that, and that's very metamodern.
Fantastic. I think that's a very good place to stop this. It's been an absolute joy listening to you.
I really appreciate it. As I said, I have a lot to say about these things, and this has really been a unique opportunity to get into them. So thank you so much for creating the...
You're very welcome. Yes. Well, in a year or so, you can come back with a different set of pictures.
Sounds good.
Or sounds.
Ooh.
Oh.
Look forward.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.